She was scrubbing a dead man's dining table when the most dangerous person in the city walked in and called her by the name she'd buried 6 months ago. Not the fake one stitched into her maid's uniform. Her real name. The one she'd killed to keep her son alive. Evelyn Hart had survived a broken jaw, 2 cracked ribs, and a husband who smiled for cameras while he choked her unconscious behind closed doors. She'd fled across state lines with a newborn strapped to her chest and $43 in a diaper bag. She had rebuilt herself from nothing, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, swallowing her pride until it tasted like battery acid. And now Luca Moretti stood 6 feet away, watching her with eyes that said he already knew every single thing she'd tried to bury. If you want to find out what happens when a runaway mother makes a deal with the devil himself, stay with this story until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The rain had been falling for 3 straight days. Not the gentle kind, not the poetic kind poets wrote about when they wanted to sound wounded and beautiful. This was the ugly kind, fat, cold sheets of water that hammered the skylights of the Moretti estate like fists against glass, the kind that found every crack in your shoes and every gap in your coat and reminded you that the world didn't owe you comfort. Evelyn Hart stood alone in the grand dining hall at midnight, dragging a damp cloth across 30 feet of mahogany while the storm rattled the windows behind her. Her shoulders ached. Her lower back had been screaming since 6 that morning. The skin on her hands was cracked and dry from industrial cleaning solution, and there was a blister forming on her right heel where the cheap shoes she'd bought at a thrift store rubbed against bone. She didn't complain. She never complained. Complaining required energy she didn't have, and more importantly, it required a voice. And Evelyn Hart had spent the last 6 months learning how to erase hers. No eye contact with the other staff, no personal conversations, no phone calls that lasted longer than 90 seconds. She came in before dawn. She left after dark. She kept her head down and her mouth shut, and she never, not once, corrected anyone who called her by the wrong name. Because the name on her employee badge wasn't Evelyn Hart. It was Marie Sutton. Marie Sutton didn't have a nursing degree. Marie Sutton didn't have a violent ex-husband with political connections and a family net worth that could buy silence from anyone with a badge. Marie Sutton didn't wake up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat, pressing her hand over her son's mouth to keep him quiet while she checked the locks for the 4th time. Marie Sutton was nobody, and nobody was exactly who Evelyn needed to be. She wrung the cloth into the bucket at her feet and wiped a strand of damp blonde hair off her forehead with the back of her wrist. The dining hall stretched out in front of her like a cathedral, vaulted ceilings, hand-carved moldings, a chandelier that probably cost more than she'd earned in her entire nursing career. The Moretti estate sat on 14 acres of gated land at the edge of the city, and everything inside it screamed money and violence in equal measure. She'd been working here for 11 weeks, long enough to learn the rhythms, long enough to know which hallways to avoid after midnight, which men on the security team would look at her too long if she walked past in anything tighter than her shapeless gray uniform, and which rooms were off-limits without exception. The West Wing, the basement level, and the private study on the 3rd floor where Luca Moretti conducted business that never appeared on any ledger. She'd never met him, not in person, not face-to-face. She'd caught glimpses, a tall silhouette crossing the courtyard in a dark coat, a low voice echoing down marble hallways during late-night meetings, the smell of expensive cologne lingering in rooms he'd left minutes earlier. The other staff spoke about him the way villagers in old stories spoke about wolves. Not with hatred, with reverence cut through by terror. "He's fair," the head housekeeper had told her on her first day, her tone clipped and careful. "But don't mistake fair for kind. If he asks you a question, answer it. If he gives you an order, follow it. And if you ever bring trouble to this house, you won't leave it the way you came in." Evelyn had nodded, swallowed hard, and never asked a follow-up question. She didn't need to. She understood men who controlled rooms without raising their voices. She'd been married to one. The difference was that Grayson Hale had used charm like a weapon and cruelty like a hobby, while Luca Moretti, from everything she'd heard, operated like weather, impersonal, inevitable, and utterly indifferent to whether you survived it. The cloth made slow circles on the table's surface. Her reflection stared back at her in the polished wood. Gaunt cheekbones, dark circles, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile without calculating the cost first. She barely recognized herself anymore. The woman who'd once held premature infants against her chest in the NICU, who'd sung lullabies to dying babies while their parents sobbed in waiting rooms, who'd believed in things like justice and decency and the basic human right to not be beaten unconscious on your own kitchen floor. That woman was gone. Or buried. Same thing, really. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Not the heavy, careless boots of the security men who patrolled the halls. Not the soft shuffle of another maid pulling a late shift. These were deliberate, measured. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who never entered a room without already knowing everything that was inside it. Evelyn didn't look up. Protocol said you didn't. You kept your eyes on your work. You became furniture. The footsteps stopped. 10 feet away. Maybe less. She could feel the presence before the voice came. A shift in the room's gravity, like the air itself had tightened. Your name isn't Marie Sutton. The voice was low, unhurried, and stripped of any emotion that might have given her something to work with. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the casual certainty of someone reading a fact off a file. Evelyn's hand stopped mid-circle on the table. The cloth dripped dirty water onto the mahogany. Don't look up. Don't react. Don't. Your name is Evelyn Hart. Her blood turned cold. She looked up. Luca Moretti stood at the far end of the dining table with both hands in the pockets of a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been sewn onto his body. No tie. Top button undone. Dark hair pushed back from a face that managed to be handsome and threatening at the same time. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, a mouth set in a line that suggested he'd heard every lie the world had to offer and had stopped being impressed by any of them. His eyes were the worst part. Dark. Still. Patient. The eyes of a man who didn't need to raise his voice because he'd already won the argument before you opened your mouth. I don't know what you're talking about, Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Small mercy. Luca tilted his head slightly, like a predator adjusting its angle of approach. Evelyn Grace Hart, he said, his tone almost conversational. Born September 14th, 31 years ago, in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of Iowa. Specialized in neonatal intensive care. Married Grayson Robert Hale 4 years ago. Filed for divorce twice. Withdrew both filings. Admitted to St. Vincent's emergency room 3 times in 18 months. Fractured orbital bone, 2 broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder. Discharged each time with no police report. He paused. You disappeared 7 months ago with your infant son. Grayson reported you as a missing person. The police searched for 3 weeks. The FBI opened a file, and then everything went quiet because someone inside Grayson's family made a phone call, and suddenly nobody was looking for you anymore. Evelyn's knees almost buckled. She gripped the edge of the table hard enough to turn her knuckles white. How? I run background checks on every person who enters this estate, Luca said. Every maid, every gardener, every delivery driver. Most of them come back clean, boring. Yours came back buried under 6 layers of falsified documents, a dead social security number, and an identity that was manufactured by someone who clearly didn't know what they were doing. He took 1 step closer. You should have paid more for the forgery. Evelyn's breath was coming in short, shallow bursts. Her mind raced through options. Deny it harder, run, beg, and landed on the only one that had kept her alive this long. The truth. If you know who I am, she said quietly, then you know why I'm hiding. Something shifted behind Luca's eyes. Not softness. Nothing close to it. But something. A flicker of recognition, maybe. The briefest indication that the answer mattered to him. I know exactly why you're hiding, he said. What I want to know is why you chose to hide here. Because nobody looks for ghosts inside a fortress. The answer came out before she could stop it. Raw. Honest. Stripped of the careful calculation that had governed every word she'd spoken for 7 months. Luca studied her for a long moment. The rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere deep in the house, a door closed. You're right, he said finally. Nobody does. He pulled a chair away from the table and sat down. Not across from her. Beside her. Close enough that she could smell cologne and something underneath it. Something sharper. Like gunpowder residue that had been washed off but never fully disappeared. Sit down, Evelyn. I'm working. You're shaking. She looked down at her hands. He was right. Her fingers were trembling against the damp cloth. She sat. Not because he told her to, because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "I'm not going to turn you in," Luca said. His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing a business arrangement. "I'm not going to contact Grayson. I'm not going to fire you, but I need you to understand something clearly, because I don't repeat myself." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Your ex-husband has been making inquiries, quiet ones. The kind that involve private investigators and offshore payments and phone calls to people who specialize in finding women who don't want to be found. He hasn't tracked you here yet, but he will. Maybe in a month, maybe in 3, maybe tomorrow. And when he does, the identity you're wearing won't last 48 hours. Evelyn felt the room tilt. "You know this," she whispered. "I know everything that happens within 50 miles of this estate." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Luca looked at her with those impossible dark eyes, and for the first time she saw something behind the mask. Not warmth, not pity, but something colder and more functional. Strategy. "I have a proposition," he said. The word landed between them like a live wire. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind that keeps your son safe and gives you the protection that no shelter, no fake ID, and no amount of running will ever provide." She waited. "I need a fiancé," Luca said. Silence. The rain roared. Evelyn stared at him. "Excuse me?" "Not a real one," he continued, as if he'd just asked her to file paperwork. "A performance. There are political pressures on my organization that require a certain public image, a committed relationship, stability, a softer face next to mine at events and in photographs. You play the role for 6 months. In exchange, you and your son live in this estate under full security. My legal team handles your custody situation, and Grayson Hale ceases to be your problem." "You're insane." "Possibly." "You want me to pretend to be engaged to a—" She stopped herself. "To a what?" His tone didn't change, but the stillness in his body sharpened. "Say it." "To a man who terrifies an entire city." "Good. Then he'll terrify your ex-husband too." Evelyn pressed her palms flat against the table to stop the shaking. Her mind was screaming at her. This was a trap, a manipulation, another man wrapping chains around her wrists and calling them bracelets. But underneath the panic, something else whispered. Noah. Her son was 8 months old. He slept in a portable crib in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and cooking grease, 2 blocks from a liquor store where a man had been stabbed last Thursday. She left him with a neighbor, a 60-year-old woman named Doris, who charged $10 a day and sometimes fell asleep in front of the television while Noah cried in the other room. Every night, Evelyn came home and checked Noah's breathing. Every night, she calculated how many more months she could survive before the money ran out. Every night, she lay awake and imagined the sound of Grayson's voice at the door. "Found you." "What happens after 6 months?" she asked. "You walk away. Clean identity, legal custody, enough money to start over anywhere you want. And if I say no," Luca leaned back in his chair, "then tomorrow morning, you go back to scrubbing tables in a uniform that doesn't fit, and you wait for the inevitable. I won't stop you, but I won't help you either." The honesty in it was almost worse than cruelty, because he was right. She was running out of time. "Why me?" she asked. "You could have anyone, women who actually belong in your world." "I don't want someone who belongs in my world. I want someone who looks like she was rescued from one. The optics serve both of us." Cold, calculated, transactional. And somehow, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. "I need to think about it." "You have until morning." He stood. The chair scraped against marble. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, a gesture so practiced it looked involuntary, and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I read every hospital report, every police intake form, every photograph in the evidence file that was sealed and buried by Grayson's father." His voice dropped. "No one is going to touch you in this house. Not him. Not anyone." Then he was gone. Evelyn sat alone at the dining table, listening to the rain destroy the world outside, and realized her hands had stopped shaking. She didn't sleep that night. She went home at 2 a.m., paid Doris, and stood over Noah's crib for 40 minutes watching him breathe. He had Grayson's chin and her mother's nose and a way of curling his fingers in his sleep that made her chest physically ache. She touched the soft crown of his head and felt the pulse of his fontanelle under her fingertip, that fragile drumbeat that reminded her how small he was, how breakable, how completely dependent on a mother who was held together by caffeine and terror and the stubborn refusal to die. She thought about what Luca said. She thought about what it meant. She thought about Grayson, the way he'd cried at their wedding, the way he'd kissed her forehead the morning after Noah was born, the way he'd slammed her head into a bathroom mirror 3 weeks later because she'd forgotten to refill his prescription. She thought about the last night in that house, the night she'd finally left. Noah had been 6 weeks old. Grayson had come home from a fundraiser drunk and wired, smelling like bourbon and another woman's perfume. He'd found her nursing Noah on the couch, and something in his face had twisted. That familiar, terrifying rearrangement of features that transformed him from the handsome, polished son of a political dynasty into something feral and unpredictable. He'd grabbed her arm hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises. Noah had started screaming. Grayson had told her to shut the baby up. She'd said no. Not loud, not brave, just no. He'd backhanded her across the mouth, blood on the couch cushion, blood on Noah's blanket. That was the night something inside her broke. Not into weakness, but into a sharp, bright thing that felt like fury and tasted like survival. She'd waited until he passed out. She'd taken Noah, a diaper bag, and $43 from the kitchen drawer. She'd walked to the bus station in bare feet at 4 a.m, and she'd never gone back. Now standing over her son's crib in a studio apartment that was slowly killing them both, she asked herself the only question that mattered. What was she willing to do to keep him safe? At 6:30 the next morning, she walked back through the service entrance of the Moretti estate. The rain had finally stopped. The sky was the color of old concrete. She found the head housekeeper, told her she needed to speak with Mr. Moretti, and was directed to the third-floor study she'd never been allowed to enter. The door was open. Luca sat behind a desk that looked older than the building, reading something on a tablet. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't need to. "Yes or no?" he said. Evelyn stood in the doorway in her maid's uniform, with her cracked hands and her cheap shoes and the weight of 7 months of running pressing down on her shoulders like wet concrete. "Yes." Luca set the tablet down. "There are conditions," he said. "I assumed. Public appearances start immediately. You'll need a wardrobe, a stylist, and a cover story we both memorize. Physical affection in public is required. Hand-holding, proximity, the occasional gesture that reads as intimate. In private, I won't touch you unless you initiate it. Understood?" "Understood. Your son will have a dedicated security detail. Private pediatrician. Nursery on the second floor of the East Wing. You will not leave the estate grounds without informing my team. That's not a request." "Fine. My attorney will begin filing custody motions this week. The legal process will take time, but the objective is full, permanent custody in your name with no visitation rights for Grayson Hale." Evelyn's throat tightened. She hadn't heard those words strung together before. Full, permanent custody. And they hit her like a physical thing, a pressure in her chest that felt dangerously close to hope. "One more thing," Luca said. He looked at her for the first time since she'd entered the room. "The people in my world will watch you closely. They'll test you. They'll try to find cracks. If you show fear, they'll exploit it. If you show weakness, they'll use it against both of us. I spent 4 years married to a man who could break my bones and still smile for the cameras at a charity dinner," Evelyn said. "I know how to perform." Something crossed Luca's face. Not quite approval, not quite respect, but adjacent to both. "Good," he said. "Then welcome to the performance." The next 72 hours were a controlled demolition of everything Evelyn had been. Marie Sutton disappeared. The employee file was shredded. The studio apartment was packed up by 2 men in black suits who never introduced themselves and never made eye contact. Noah's portable crib was replaced by a mahogany nursery set that probably cost more than her car, if she'd still had a car. Evelyn was moved into a suite on the second floor of the East Wing, 2 rooms connected by a sitting area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate's manicured grounds. The closet was already stocked with clothes she hadn't picked out. Tasteful, expensive, nothing flashy. The kind of wardrobe that whispered money without shouting it. A woman named Greta arrived the second morning. Short, efficient, German accent, Zero patience for hesitation. She was a stylist, apparently. She spent 3 hours with Evelyn. Hair, skin, nails, posture, the way she held a champagne glass, the way she entered a room. "You're not a maid anymore," Greta said flatly, adjusting Evelyn's shoulders. "Stop standing like one." "Old habit. Break it. You're supposed to be the woman who captured Luca Moretti. Act like you deserve to be here." Evelyn gritted her teeth and straightened her spine. Noah adjusted faster than she did. He seemed to love the nursery. The soft lighting, the warmth, the mobile spinning above his crib that played something classical she didn't recognize. A nanny named Teresa was assigned to him during the hours Evelyn had to be elsewhere. Teresa was in her 50s, quiet, maternal in a way that didn't feel competitive, and Noah reached for her on the second day. Evelyn told herself she wasn't jealous. She was lying. On the third night, Luca summoned her to dinner, not in the grand dining hall, a smaller room on the ground floor, intimate, candlelit, clearly designed for the kind of meals that involved negotiation rather than nourishment. He was already seated when she arrived, studying a glass of red wine like it owed him money. He looked up. She was wearing a fitted navy dress Greta had selected. Her hair was down for the first time in months, blonde, falling past her shoulders, clean and soft in a way it hadn't been since before Grayson. She'd put on minimal makeup. She still had dark circles under her eyes, but Greta had taught her how to make exhaustion look deliberate instead of desperate. Luca's gaze moved over her once, quick, clinical. "Sit," he said. She sat. "We need a story," he said. "The public version. How we met, when, why. Something simple enough to repeat under pressure, but specific enough to feel authentic." "You've done this before?" "No." "Then how do you know what works?" "Because I know what doesn't. Elaborate lies collapse under scrutiny. Simple ones survive." He poured her a glass of wine without asking if she wanted one. "We met 6 months ago," he said, "through a mutual associate. I pursued you. You resisted. Eventually you agreed to dinner. The rest happened naturally." "That's vague." "Vague is safe." "It's also boring. If someone asks me what I love about you, vague isn't going to sell it." Luca set his glass down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "What would you say?" Evelyn held his gaze. This was a test. She could feel it. "I'd say you scared me at first," she said slowly. "That you were nothing like what I expected. That you were patient when I wasn't ready, and that you didn't push me. That you made me feel safe for the first time in a long time." Silence stretched between them. "That's almost convincing," Luca said. "Give me a few weeks. I'll make it bulletproof." He picked up his wine glass again, and for the first time she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Almost a smile. Almost. The first public appearance came 5 days later. A private dinner at a restaurant Evelyn had walked past 100 times, but never imagined entering. The kind of place where reservations were made months in advance, and a single bottle of wine cost more than her old monthly rent. Luca arrived in a dark suit, no tie again. He held the car door open for her and placed his hand on the small of her back as they walked inside. The touch was light, but unmistakable, proprietary. A declaration. Heads turned. Every head in the restaurant. The maitre d' practically bowed. Waiters materialized. A corner table appeared that hadn't existed on the floor plan 5 minutes earlier, and Luca guided her to it with his hand still on her back, his body angled toward hers in a way that said, "Mine," without a single word. Evelyn's pulse was racing, but she kept her face composed. She smiled when he pulled out her chair. She leaned toward him when he spoke. She laughed at something he said, genuinely, which surprised her. And she let her fingers brush against his across the table in a gesture that looked natural, because it almost was. She caught people staring, not the polite kind, the hungry kind. Phones appeared under tablecloths. She knew pictures were being taken. "Relax," Luca murmured, his mouth close to her ear. To anyone watching, it looked like intimacy. Up close, it was tactical. "I am relaxed." "Your jaw is clenched." She forced it loose. "Better," he said. His breath was warm against her skin. "You're doing well." The words shouldn't have mattered. They were part of the act, part of the choreography. But something about the way he said them, quiet, private, not for anyone else's consumption, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She pushed the feeling down hard and fast. This was a job, a transaction, a survival strategy. Nothing more. The photographs hit the tabloids by the next morning. Moretti's mystery woman. Who is the blonde beauty who captured the kingpin's heart? The city lost its collective mind. Evelyn's face was everywhere, splashed across gossip sites, dissected on social media, analyzed by amateur sleuths who couldn't figure out where she'd come from or who she was. Within 48 hours, 3 different outlets had published wildly inaccurate profiles of Luca Moretti's new love interest. One claimed she was a European model. Another said she was the daughter of a foreign diplomat. A third, closer to the truth than it knew, suggested she was a woman with a past that someone had gone to great lengths to erase. Luca monitored all of it with the detachment of a man reading weather reports. Let them speculate, he told her over coffee the next morning in his study. Curiosity is useful. It makes people cautious. And when they dig deeper, they'll find exactly what my team has placed for them to find. A carefully constructed digital history that leads nowhere threatening and satisfies just enough questions to make them stop looking. You fabricated a past for me? I improved on the one you already had. Evelyn sat back in her chair and studied him. He was reading something on his phone, one ankle crossed over his knee, completely at ease in a way that seemed almost offensive given the chaos swirling outside the estate walls. Does anything rattle you? She asked. He didn't look up. No. She believed him. Over the following weeks, the rhythm established itself. Public appearances 2 or 3 times a week. Dinners, gallery openings, a hospital fundraiser where Luca wrote a check large enough to make the hospital administrator's hand shake. At each event, the performance deepened. His hand found hers automatically now. She'd started leaning into him without thinking about it. When he whispered something close to her ear, she no longer flinched. She hated how natural it was becoming. In private, Luca kept the distance he'd promised. He didn't visit her rooms, he didn't appear uninvited. When they were alone, the intimacy evaporated, and what remained was a professional arrangement conducted by 2 people who understood the terms. Except for the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. During a quiet moment at a charity event, she'd been adjusting Noah's collar in a side room, murmuring to the baby, smiling in a way she only smiled when she forgot anyone was watching. She'd glanced up and caught Luca standing in the doorway. The look on his face had lasted less than a second, but she'd seen it. Something raw. Something unguarded. Something that didn't belong in the eyes of a man who claimed to feel nothing. She didn't mention it. He didn't either. And then Grayson found her. Came as a text message sent from an unknown number to the phone Luca's team had provided. 3 words. I found you. Evelyn was sitting in the nursery with Noah on her lap when the message arrived. She read it 3 times. The room tilted. Her vision narrowed to a point. For a moment, one terrible, breathless moment, she was back in that house, back on the kitchen floor, back pressing her hand over her own mouth to keep from screaming, because screaming made it worse. Noah grabbed a fistful of her hair and squealed. The sound pulled her back. She called Luca's security chief immediately. 15 minutes later, Luca himself appeared in the nursery doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. He took the phone from her hand, read the message. When did this arrive? 8 minutes ago. Has he contacted you before? Not since I left. Luca's jaw tightened. He handed the phone to the security chief without looking at him. Trace it. I want the number, the carrier, and the location of the device within the hour. The chief nodded and left. Luca stood in the nursery, surrounded by soft lighting and lullaby music, looking like violence made human. He won't get near you, he said. You don't know him. I know everything about him. I've known about Grayson Hale since the night I learned your real name. He stepped closer. He's a coward with family money and a talent for hurting women. Those men don't scare me. Those men are the reason I exist. The words landed with a weight that went beyond reassurance. There was something personal in them, an edge of old fury that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something buried deep. Evelyn looked at him, holding her son against her chest, and for the first time since she'd agreed to this arrangement, She felt something she hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not relief. Trust. And that scared her more than Grayson's message ever could, because the last time she'd trusted a man, he'd broken her jaw. 2 days later, the first real test came. Evelyn was in the East Wing corridor, walking back to her suite after a fitting with Greta, when she turned a corner and found a man leaning against the wall outside her door. He was mid-30s, thick-necked, wearing an expensive suit that didn't quite hide the predatory energy underneath. She recognized him from a photograph in Luca's file. Dominic Voss, a mid-level associate who handled territory disputes on the South Side. He smiled when he saw her. "So you're the new queen," he said. His eyes crawled over her in a way that made her skin prickle. "Gotta hand it to Luca. Man's got taste." "Can I help you with something?" "Just wanted to introduce myself." He pushed off the wall and stepped toward her. Close. Too close. She could smell whiskey and cologne and something underneath both that registered as danger. "Dom Voss? I run things on the South End. We'll be seeing a lot of each other." "I doubt that." His smile widened. He reached out and touched the sleeve of her blouse, running his fingers along the fabric. "Nice material. Must be expensive." His eyes moved from the blouse to her face. "Everything about you looks expensive now. Funny how that works." Evelyn's chest tightened, but she didn't step back. She'd learned a long time ago that retreating from men like this only encouraged them. "Take your hand off me." "Relax, sweetheart. I'm just being friendly." "Take your hand off me." He laughed. A short, ugly sound. And then the hallway went cold. Evelyn didn't see Luca approach. She didn't hear him. One moment, the corridor was empty behind Voss, and the next, Luca was there, materializing from the shadows like something that had always been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. His hand closed around Voss's wrist with a grip that turned the larger man's face white. "Dominic," one word, barely above a whisper. And the temperature in the hallway dropped another 10 degrees. Voss's smile evaporated. He tried to pull his hand back. Luca didn't let go. I was just talking to her." "You were touching her." "It was nothing, Luca. Come on." Luca's grip tightened. Evelyn heard something in Voss's wrist click. Not a break, but close. A warning in bone. "If you touch her again," Luca said, his voice so quiet Evelyn had to strain to hear it, "I will remove the hand. And then I will remove you from every business arrangement, every territory, and every protection agreement you currently enjoy. You'll be standing on a street corner within a week, explaining to people who used to fear you why you no longer matter." He released Voss's wrist. Voss stumbled backward. His face was gray. He looked at Evelyn, then at Luca, then at the floor. "It won't happen again," he muttered. "No," Luca agreed. "It won't." Voss left without another word. His footsteps echoed down the corridor at a pace that was almost but not quite running. Evelyn stood perfectly still, her heart hammering in her chest. Luca turned to her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "You're shaking again." She looked down at her hands. Steady. She looked back up at him. "No, I'm not." Something passed between them in that corridor. An understanding that went beyond the terms of their arrangement. He'd defended her not like a man protecting an asset. He'd defended her like a man who couldn't stand the thought of someone putting their hands on her. And Evelyn, standing in the hallway of a crime lord's mansion, with her son sleeping 2 rooms away and her ex-husband closing in, made a terrifying realization. She was starting to feel safe, not the cautious, conditional safety of locks and false names and sleeping with one eye open. Real safety. The kind that lived in another person, the kind she'd sworn she'd never trust again. That night, after Noah was asleep and the estate had gone quiet, Evelyn stood at the window of her suite and watched Luca cross the courtyard below. He walked alone, his hands in his pockets, his face tilted up toward a sky that had finally cleared after days of rain. He stopped in the middle of the courtyard and stood there for a long time, perfectly still, staring at nothing. She watched him and thought about monsters, about the ones who wore kind faces and the ones who didn't bother, about the ones who hurt you in private and the ones who protected you in public, about the terrifying possibility that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room was also the safest. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up. Another unknown number, another message from a ghost she couldn't outrun. This one was longer. You think he can protect you? You think some thug in an expensive suit can keep me from what's mine? Noah is my son. You're my wife. And when this little game you're playing falls apart, and it will, I'll be waiting. You know how this ends, Evelyn. You've always known. Her hand shook so hard the phone nearly slipped from her grip. She didn't call security this time. She walked down the hallway, down the stairs, through the silent corridors of the Moretti estate, and out onto the courtyard where Luca was still standing alone in the dark. He heard her coming. He turned. She held up the phone. He read the message. His face didn't change. His body didn't move. But something behind his eyes went very, very quiet, the way the sky goes quiet before the worst kind of storm. "Go to bed," he said softly. "I'll handle this." "What are you going to do?" He looked at her. Rain-washed moonlight caught the angles of his face and turned them into something carved from stone. "Whatever I have to." Evelyn stood in the courtyard in bare feet and a borrowed robe, looking at the man who held her future in his hands, and realized with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water. She was no longer pretending, and neither was he. Luca didn't come back inside for 2 hours. Evelyn knew because she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed with the lights off and the curtains open, watching the courtyard below, watching the place where he'd stood reading Grayson's message. He'd made 3 phone calls. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read his body, the way he paced in slow, deliberate circles, the way his free hand opened and closed at his side like he was working through a calculation that kept producing answers he didn't like. When he finally crossed the courtyard and disappeared through the east entrance, the clock on her nightstand read 1:47 a.m. She heard his footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside her door. A pause, long enough that she could picture him standing there, one hand raised, deciding whether to knock. He didn't. The footsteps continued down the hall and faded into nothing. Evelyn lay back on his bed and pressed both palms against her eyes until she saw white spots. Her chest felt like someone had poured concrete into it, heavy, hardening, impossible to breathe around. She rolled onto her side and stared at the baby monitor on the nightstand. The green light pulsed steadily. Noah was sleeping. Noah was safe. That was enough. That had to be enough. She fell asleep sometime after 3 and woke at 6 to the sound of Noah fussing through the monitor. She went to him immediately, lifted him from the crib, and pressed her face into the warm curve of his neck. He smelled like baby soap and formula, and something underneath that was just him, his own particular smell that she could have identified in a room full of infants with her eyes closed. "Hey, little man," she whispered. "We're okay. We're still okay." He grabbed her ear and pulled. By 8 o'clock, the estate was already moving at a pace that felt different, sharper. Evelyn noticed it immediately when she brought Noah downstairs for breakfast. More security personnel in the hallways, unfamiliar faces positioned at doors that were normally unguarded. The household staff moved faster, quieter, with the nervous efficiency of people who understood that something had shifted overnight. She found Luca in the small dining room. He was sitting at the table with a cup of black coffee and no food, reading something on a tablet. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. Shirt wrinkled at the cuffs, shadow of stubble darker than usual, a tightness around his eyes that she hadn't seen before. He glanced up when she entered with Noah on her hip. "Sit down." She sat across from him. Noah banged a small fist on the table and made a sound that was half laugh, half shriek. "The number was a burner," Luca said, not looking up from the tablet. "Purchased in cash from a convenience store 40 miles south of here. Used once. Already deactivated. So you can't trace it back to him." "I don't need to trace it back to him. I know it's him. What matters is how he got your new number." The implication landed in Evelyn's stomach like a stone. "Someone in the estate gave it to him," she said. "Someone in the estate gave it to him." Luca set the tablet down and looked at her. The exhaustion in his face made his features harder, not softer, like fatigue had stripped away the layer of polish that usually kept him looking composed and revealed something more angular underneath. "More dangerous. I have 43 people on this property at any given time," he said. "Staff, security, groundskeepers, kitchen. 11 of them have access to the household's internal directory, which includes your contact information. My team is running background on all 11. Financial records, phone logs, family connections." "You think someone's being paid?" I think Grayson's family has the kind of money that makes loyalty negotiable. Noah reached for Luca's coffee cup. Evelyn caught his hand and redirected it. Luca watched the movement, her fingers closing gently around Noah's, guiding them away, with an expression she couldn't quite name. "How long will it take?" she asked. "A few days? Maybe a week? And until then?" "Until then, you don't leave the East Wing without a member of my personal detail. Not the main security team, mine." "I thought the main team was yours." "The main team is paid to protect the property. My personal detail is paid to protect what matters." He picked up his coffee and took a long drink, and the casualness of it, the way he'd just categorized her and Noah as what matters without changing his tone or his expression, made something in Evelyn's chest constrict. She didn't respond to it. She couldn't, because responding meant acknowledging what was happening between them, and acknowledging it meant admitting that the lines she'd drawn on the first night were already starting to blur. And admitting that meant she was making the same mistake she'd sworn on her son's life she would never make again, trusting a powerful man who said he'd keep her safe. 2 days later, they found the leak. His name was Curtis Webb. He'd been on the housekeeping staff for 4 years, so reliable, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of man who blended into walls. The kind of man nobody suspected because nobody noticed him. Luca's financial team found a wire transfer from an offshore account connected to the Hale family's law firm. $12,000, deposited into a secondary savings account Webb had opened under his mother's maiden name 3 weeks ago. $12,000 for a phone number and a handful of photographs. Pictures of Evelyn in the estate's garden, pictures of Noah in the nursery window, pictures of the security rotation schedule. Luca told Evelyn about it in the study that evening. He delivered the information the way he delivered everything, flat, precise, devoid of unnecessary emotion. But his hands were different. He was standing behind his desk, and his hands were resting on the surface with his fingers spread, pressing down hard enough that the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. "Where is he now?" Evelyn asked. "Being questioned." "What does that mean?" Luca looked at her. "It means what you think it means." Something cold moved through her, not sympathy for Curtis Webb, not even horror at what Luca's people might be doing to extract information. Something colder and more honest than either. A recognition that she didn't care. That a man had sold photographs of her infant son to the person who had fractured her face, and whatever happened to that man in the basement of this estate was a consequence she could live with. The realization terrified her, because it meant she was adapting. She was becoming someone who could exist in Luca Moretti's world without flinching, and she wasn't sure whether that made her stronger or proved she was already lost. "What did he give them?" she asked. "Your phone number, your daily routine, Noah's schedule, photographs of the security layout. Nothing about the engagement arrangement specifically, but enough to confirm your location and your movements. So Grayson knows exactly where I am. Grayson has known where you are for at least 2 weeks." The room went very still. 2 weeks, Evelyn repeated. "He's known for 2 weeks and he hasn't moved." "Correct." "Why?" "Because he's not stupid enough to come at you directly. Not while you're inside these walls." Luca straightened from the desk. "He'll go legal. A custody motion. He'll use the photographs to establish that you're living with a known criminal associate and argue that Noah is in an unsafe environment." The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. "The safest I've ever been in my life, and he'll use it to take my son." "He'll try." "And your lawyers?" "Are already preparing a counterfiling. We'll submit the hospital records, the sealed police reports, the evidence of the Hale family's interference in the original investigation. But Evelyn," he paused. He rarely used her first name. When he did, it carried a gravity that felt almost physical. "I need you to understand something. Legal battles against families with this kind of money and influence are wars of attrition. They don't fight fair, they don't follow rules, and they don't stop." "I know." "Do you?" "Because what I'm about to ask you requires a commitment that goes beyond what we originally agreed to." She waited. "The engagement party," Luca said. "It needs to happen sooner than planned. Not in 2 months. In 2 weeks." "Why?" "Because right now, as far as the public is concerned, you're Luca Moretti's girlfriend. That's a target. A fiancé is different. A fiancé is a declaration. It changes the calculation for everyone: Grayson, his family, the courts, the press. It makes attacking you an attack on me, and people who attack me don't get second chances. Evelyn stood in the study with her arms crossed, feeling the weight of what he was proposing settle over her like armor. You're asking me to go deeper. I'm asking you to go all the way in. And if it doesn't work? If the courts side with him anyway? Luca's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A darkness that went beyond anger into something more primal, more absolute. Then we stopped playing by the court's rules. She should have been afraid of what that meant. She wasn't. That scared her most of all. Fine, she said. 2 weeks. The preparations consumed the estate like a fever. Florists arrived with truckloads of arrangements. Event coordinators swept through the ground floor measuring rooms and arguing about lighting. A guest list was drafted that read like a who's who of the city's power structure. Politicians, business leaders, media figures, and a carefully curated selection of criminal contacts who understood that their presence was not optional. Through all of it, Luca moved with the precision of a military strategist planning a campaign. Every detail was deliberate. Every invitation was calculated. Every element of the evening served a dual purpose: social spectacle on the surface, strategic positioning underneath. And through all of it, the tension between him and Evelyn ratcheted tighter. It started with small things. A morning when she came downstairs with Noah and found Luca already in the kitchen, not his study, making coffee, sleeves rolled up, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. He'd handed her a cup without being asked, prepared exactly the way she took it. She hadn't told him how she took her coffee. He'd noticed on his own. An afternoon when Noah had been crying for 40 minutes, teething, inconsolable, that particular shriek that drilled through your skull. And Evelyn had been pacing the nursery with him, exhausted, on the verge of tears herself. Luca had appeared in the doorway. He hadn't said anything. He'd just extended his arms. She'd handed Noah over without thinking, and Luca had settled the baby against his chest with a steadiness that seemed involuntary, one hand supporting Noah's head, the other flat against his back. Noah had gone quiet within 2 minutes. Evelyn had stood 3 feet away watching a man who commanded a criminal empire hold her son like he was made of something precious, and felt something crack open inside her chest that she couldn't close again. An evening when they were rehearsing their story for the engagement party, seated on opposite ends of a couch in the sitting room, going through likely questions from guests, and Luca had asked her to describe the moment she knew she loved him. For the cover story, he clarified. Right, she said. The cover story. Silence. I'd say it was the night I brought Noah to you in the courtyard, she said slowly. The night Grayson sent the second message. You read it, and you didn't promise me everything would be fine. You didn't tell me not to worry. You just said you'd handle it. She looked at him. I'd say that was when I knew, because every other man I've ever trusted told me what I wanted to hear. You told me the truth. Luca held her gaze for a long time. The sitting room was quiet. Late evening light filtered through the windows and turned the space amber. That's good, he said finally. His voice was rougher than usual. That'll work. Is it just working? The question left her mouth before she could catch it. Direct, exposed, hanging in the air between them like a lit match over gasoline. Luca's jaw tightened. Evelyn. Forget I asked. I can't forget something I've been trying not to answer for 3 weeks. The honesty of it hit her like a fist. She looked away, looked back. His eyes hadn't moved. This is a bad idea, she whispered. Yes. For both of us. Yes. So we don't. We don't. Neither of them moved. The space between them on the couch felt like it was humming, charged with something electric and terrifying that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with 2 people who had been broken by the world in different ways, discovering that their jagged edges fit together in a pattern that shouldn't have worked but did. Evelyn stood up. Good night, Luca. Good night. She walked to the door, stopped, didn't turn around. For the record, she said quietly, I wasn't making it up. The cover story. None of it was made up. She left before he could respond. 4 days before the engagement party, Grayson Hale made his move. Evelyn was returning from a final fitting with Greta when Marco, the head of Luca's personal detail, intercepted her in the corridor with a face the color of ash. "We have a situation," he said. He led her to Luca's study. Luca was standing behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, rapid tone that she'd never heard from him before. Not controlled, not measured, furious. He ended the call when she walked in. "Grayson filed an emergency custody petition this morning," Luca said. "He's alleging parental kidnapping, child endangerment, and cohabitation with a known criminal enterprise. He's requesting an emergency hearing within 72 hours. Evelyn's knees went soft. She grabbed the back of the nearest chair. 72 hours? That's before the party. That's the point. His lawyers are trying to get a court order to remove Noah from the estate before we can make the engagement public. Can they do that?" Luca's silence was its own answer. "There's more," he said. "Grayson's father has retained Gerald Thorne." The name landed like a bomb. Even Evelyn, who knew nothing about legal warfare at this level, recognized it. Gerald Thorne was the most expensive family law attorney on the Eastern Seaboard, a man who had never lost a custody case, and whose client list included senators, hedge fund managers, and at least 2 members of a royal family. "Thorne doesn't take cases he can't win," Evelyn said. "No, he doesn't." She felt the floor dropping away beneath her. Everything, the estate, the security, the legal team, the performance, all of it, suddenly felt like a house of cards trembling in a wind she couldn't see. "What do we do?" Luca walked around the desk. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that she could see the vein pulsing in his temple, the way his breathing had gone shallow even though his face remained perfectly composed. "We move the party up." "To when?" "Tomorrow night." "Tomorrow." "Luca, that's impossible. The caterers alone. I don't care about the caterers. I care about establishing a public, documented, irrefutable record that you are my fiancé before that hearing takes place. I care about putting every powerful person in this city in a room and making them watch me put a ring on your finger. I care about making it politically, socially, and personally catastrophic for any judge to hand your son to a man who beats women." His voice hadn't risen, not once, but the intensity of it pressed against her like heat from an open furnace. "Tomorrow night," he repeated. "Every guest on the list gets a call within the hour. My team handles the logistics. All you have to do is show up and be exactly who you've been for the last 2 months. "And who's that?" He looked at her. His mask was gone. The calculation was gone. What was left was something bare and fierce that she felt in the center of her chest, like a second heartbeat. "Mine," he said. One word. Not a performance. Not a strategy. A claim. And standing in that study with her son's future hanging by a thread and a man she'd sworn she'd never trust, staring at her with eyes that held more truth than fear, Evelyn Hart made the decision that changed everything. She didn't step back. She stepped forward. She placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and felt it hammering beneath the expensive fabric, fast, hard, out of control. The heartbeat of a man who was not as composed as he pretended to be, who had maybe never been as composed as he pretended to be. "Then make it real," she said. Luca's hand came up and covered hers. His fingers closed around her wrist. Not rough, not possessive, but absolute. The grip of a man who was done pretending he didn't want to hold on. "It's been real," he said quietly, "since the night you walked into the courtyard in bare feet and handed me that phone. It's been real since then." The space between them collapsed. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse suite paid for by old money and older cruelty, Grayson Hale set down his phone and smiled at the man sitting across from him. A man with a briefcase full of sealed photographs, a court order half signed, and the cold, patient expression of someone who destroyed families for a living. "Tomorrow," Grayson said, "we take back what's mine." The estate moved like a wartime command center through the night. Evelyn stood at the second-floor landing at 1:30 in the morning, watching teams of workers flood the grand hall below. Florists hauled in arrangements that should have taken days to assemble. Caterers rolled industrial carts through the service entrance, unloading crystal, silver, linens. Lighting technicians climbed scaffolding to adjust chandeliers. The marble floors had been polished twice already, and someone was polishing them again, working on hands and knees in the reflected glow of 1,000 pendant lights. It looked like a wedding being assembled at gunpoint, which, in a way, it was. Evelyn hadn't slept. She'd gone back to her suite after leaving Luca's study, checked on Noah 3 times, showered in water so hot it turned her skin pink, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for 10 minutes, staring at a woman she was still learning to recognize. The bruises were long gone. The dark circles had faded under Greta's careful attention. Her hair was clean and soft and blonde and fell past her shoulders like it belonged in a magazine, and she hated how much easier it was to look at herself when she looked expensive. Because expensive was a costume, and costumes came off. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the landing window and watched her breath fog the surface. Somewhere below, she heard Luca's voice, low, clipped, issuing orders to someone whose responses came too fast and too nervous. He'd been in motion since she'd left the study. No sleep, no pause. The entire machinery of his empire redirected toward a single objective: make the world witness this engagement before Grayson's lawyers could drag her into a courtroom. Her phone buzzed into the pocket of her robe. She pulled it out, expecting another threat from an unknown number. It was Marco, Luca's head of personal security. "Come to the kitchen, now!" She went. The kitchen was industrial-sized, stainless steel, white tile, harsh fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly ill. Marco stood near the walk-in refrigerator with 2 members of Luca's personal detail flanking a man who was seated in a metal chair, wrists zip-tied behind his back. Curtis Webb. Evelyn barely recognized him. His face was swollen on the left side, not dramatically, not cinematically, but in the real and ugly way that faces swelled when they'd been hit by someone who knew where to hit. One eye was narrowed to a slit. His lower lip was split and crusted with dried blood. He was breathing through his mouth in short, wet gasps. Marco looked at Evelyn. "He wants to talk to you." "To me?" "Says he won't talk to anyone else." She looked at Curtis Webb. 4 years of quiet, reliable service, a man who'd mopped the same floors she had, who'd nodded politely when they passed in hallways, who'd sold pictures of her sleeping son to the man who'd broken her face. "Fine," she said. Marco stepped aside. Evelyn pulled a chair from a nearby counter and sat 3 feet from Webb, close enough to see the tremor in his hands, close enough to smell fear, sweat, and blood. "Talk," she said. Webb lifted his head. The good eye focused on her with the desperate clarity of a man who understood he was running out of options. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was raw, scraped. "When they first contacted me, I didn't know who you were. They said they were private investigators working a missing persons case. They showed me a badge, said a mother had taken a child illegally and they were trying to reunite the father with his son." "And you believed that?" "I believed it because they paid me to believe it. 12 grand, Miss Hart. That's what my mother's assisted living facility costs for 6 months. She's got dementia. She doesn't know my name most days, but she knows when the room gets cold because they turned off the heat." His voice cracked. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know what I did. I know what it cost. But there's something else. Something I told Mr. Moretti's people already, but I don't think they understood how bad it is." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "What?" Webb leaned forward, the zip ties strained behind him. "The man who contacted me, the one who paid me. He wasn't just buying information about you, he was buying information about the estate's security, the rotation schedules, the camera blind spots, the staff entry codes for the East Wing. I gave him everything. I didn't understand why until 2 days ago, when he contacted me again." Webb's good eye locked onto hers. "He asked me about tomorrow night, the party. He wanted to know the layout, the guest entrance procedures, how many security personnel would be stationed inside versus outside. He wanted to know if there was a way to get someone into the estate without going through the main checkpoint." The blood drained from Evelyn's face. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes. The service entrance on the north side, catering staff come through there. No biometric check, just badge IDs that could be duplicated by anyone with a decent printer." Evelyn was on her feet before she finished processing the words. She turned to Marco. "Does Luca know this?" Marco's face was grim. "He knows. He's in the study with his security chief right now, restructuring the entire perimeter plan. Evelyn looked back at Webb. The man was crying now, silent, ugly tears that tracked through the dried blood on his chin. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry." Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. She thought about his mother in the assisted living facility. She thought about what $12,000 meant to a man who mopped floors for a living. She thought about the calculations people made when they were desperate, the lies they told themselves, the lines they crossed, the quiet deals they struck with their own conscience at 3 a.m. when the bills were stacking up and the alternatives were running out. She thought about herself 7 months ago, walking into a forger's apartment with her last $200 and a baby on her hip. "I know you are," she said. Then she left the kitchen and went to find Luca. She found him in the study, standing over a table covered with printed diagrams of the estate's layout. Security Chief Aldo Renner, a thick, silver-haired man with the demeanor of a retired tank commander, stood beside him, marking positions on the diagram with a red pen. 3 other men she didn't recognize occupied chairs along the wall, all of them armed, all of them silent. Luca looked up when she entered. His face was carved from something harder than exhaustion now. A tight, controlled focus that reminded her of surgeons she'd worked with in the NICU, the ones who went calm when everything around them was falling apart. "You talked to Webb," he said. "He's scared." "He should be." Luca. If Grayson is trying to get someone inside the party, he's not trying to get someone inside the party. He's trying to get himself inside the party. The room went cold. "Think about it," Luca continued, his voice flat and methodical. "An emergency custody petition filed 72 hours before the event. A paid informant inside the estate providing security layouts. A request for entry procedures through the service entrance. He's not sending a proxy. He's coming himself." "Why? What does he gain by being here?" Aldo answered. "Confrontation. If he can provoke an incident at the engagement party, get Moretti on camera losing control, get footage of a physical altercation in front of 200 witnesses, he hands his lawyers everything they need, a violent criminal environment, an unsafe home for a child." "He wants Luca to hit him," Evelyn said. "He wants me to destroy him in public," Luca corrected. "And every instinct I have is telling me to do exactly that." The honesty of it settled over the room like smoke. Evelyn watched Luca's hands on the table, the fingers pressed flat, the knuckles white, the controlled tremor of a man holding himself in check through sheer force of will. "You can't," she said. "I know. If you touch him, I know, Evelyn. Then what do we do?" Luca straightened. He looked at Aldo, then at the 3 armed men along the wall, then back at Evelyn. "We let him in." Silence. "We let him through the service entrance. We let him walk into the party. We let him stand in a room full of the most powerful people in this city and watch me put a ring on your finger. And when he makes his move, because he will, because men like Grayson can't stand to watch someone else hold what they believe belongs to them, we let the room see exactly who he is." That's insane. That's strategy. You're gambling with my son's life. I'm gambling with nothing. Noah will be in the East Wing with Teresa, Marco, and 2 additional members of my personal detail. Grayson will never get within 200 feet of that nursery. What he'll get is a room full of witnesses who watch him unravel in real time. Evelyn's chest was heaving. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to grab the diagrams off the table and tear them apart. She wanted to pick up Noah and run. Out the door, into the night, back to the bus stations, and the fake names, and the $43 in a diaper bag. But she'd tried running. Running hadn't worked. "And if he doesn't unravel?" she asked. "If he keeps his composure? If he walks in and smiles and charms the room the way he's always charmed every room he's ever walked into?" Luca looked at her with something that wasn't calculation and wasn't arrogance and wasn't confidence. It was certainty, the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life studying the weak points of dangerous people. "He won't keep his composure," Luca said, "because I'm going to give him something he can't ignore." "What?" "The truth." The engagement party began at 7 o'clock the following evening. Evelyn stood in front of the full-length mirror in her suite and barely breathed. The gown was emerald silk, floor-length, fitted through the bodice, with a neckline that was elegant without being provocative. Greta had outdone herself. Hair swept up, exposing the line of her neck. Minimal jewelry, a single pair of diamond earrings that caught the light every time she turned her head. She looked like a woman who belonged in this world. She looked like someone she didn't recognize. Noah was already settled in the East Wing nursery with Teresa and the security detail. She'd kissed him 14 times before leaving. He'd laughed at the lipstick marks on his forehead. The grand hall was unrecognizable. Thousands of candles lined the perimeter. The chandeliers had been dimmed to a warm amber. White flowers cascaded from every surface. A string quartet played something classical that floated above the murmur of 200 guests in formal attire. Politicians, district attorneys, media executives, business leaders, and scattered among them like wolves in evening wear, the criminal contacts whose presence turned the evening from a social event into a demonstration of power. Luca was waiting for her at the bottom of the main staircase. Black suit, no tie. The top button of his shirt undone in that way that had become his signature. The deliberate informality of a man who didn't need to follow rules because he made them. He watched her descend the stairs with an expression that stripped away every layer of pretense they'd spent 2 months constructing. Not the calculated admiration of a fake fiancé, not the practiced warmth of a performance. Something raw, something naked, something that made every person within 20 feet stop talking and stare. He extended his hand. She took it. His fingers closed around hers and she felt his pulse. Fast, faster than it should have been. The heartbeat of a man who was not as steady as he appeared. "You're stunning," he said quietly. Just for her. "You're terrified," she said back. Just for him. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Absolutely." They moved through the crowd together, and the room rearranged itself around them like iron filings around a magnet. Luca's hand found the small of her back. She leaned into him. Guests approached in careful waves. Congratulations delivered with the nervous precision of people who understood that the man beside her could elevate or erase them with a phone call. Evelyn smiled. She shook hands. She answered questions about how they met with the rehearsed story that no longer felt rehearsed because most of it was true now. She caught Luca watching her across conversations. That unguarded look again, the one he couldn't quite hide anymore, and felt it resonate in her chest like a second heartbeat. An hour in, 2 hours. The evening was working. The energy in the room was building toward the main event. The formal announcement, the ring, the public declaration that would change the legal calculus forever. And then she saw him. Across the grand hall near the service bar, holding a glass of champagne with the casual confidence of a man who had never been told no. Grayson Hale. He'd come through the service entrance exactly as Luca predicted. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost $5,000. His sandy hair swept back, his jaw clean-shaven, his blue eyes scanning the room with the easy charm that had fooled judges, police officers, hospital administrators, and a 26-year-old nurse who'd believed him when he said he'd never do it again. He looked handsome. He looked normal. He looked like every lie she'd ever believed about what dangerous men were supposed to look like. His eyes found hers across the room. He smiled, and every cell in Evelyn's body went cold. Luca felt her body change before he saw the reason. The tension that locked through her spine, the way her fingers tightened on his arm, the sudden shallow rhythm of her breathing. He followed her gaze. His face didn't move. His body didn't tense. But his hand, the one resting on her back, pressed harder. A fraction of an inch. A signal. "I see him. I'm here. Don't move." Grayson set down his champagne glass and began walking toward them. Slow. Deliberate. Smiling the whole time. The crowd parted around him without knowing why. Some animal instinct responding to the predatory ease of his movement. He stopped 6 feet away. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was warm, friendly, the voice of a concerned father at a school function, not a man who had slammed his wife's head into a mirror. "You look incredible. Really, I almost didn't recognize you." Evelyn's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Luca spoke instead. "You're not on the guest list." "No," Grayson agreed, still smiling. "But I heard there was a celebration, and I thought, well, Noah's father should probably be here for something this important, don't you think?" The name hit Evelyn like a slap. Around them, conversations were dying. Heads were turning. The string quartet kept playing, but nobody was listening anymore. Luca took one step forward. You have 30 seconds to leave this estate before I have you removed in a way that will be significantly less pleasant than walking. Grayson's smile widened. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document. Actually, I think I'll stay. He unfolded the paper and held it up. A court-stamped document with a judge's signature at the bottom. Emergency custody order, signed 2 hours ago by Judge Catherine Marsden. It grants me immediate temporary custody of Noah Hale and authorizes law enforcement to remove him from any premises where he is currently being held. The room went silent, completely, devastatingly silent. Evelyn felt the floor drop away beneath her feet. She reached for Luca's arm and gripped it hard enough to dig her nails through the fabric of his suit. "That's not possible," she whispered. "That's not... The hearing wasn't until..." "My lawyers moved it up," Grayson said. His smile hadn't changed. It was the same smile he'd worn the night he broke her ribs. Emergency basis. Given the documented evidence that my son is currently residing in the home of a known criminal organization, Judge Marsden was very sympathetic. He took another step closer. His voice dropped to something only the three of them could hear. "Did you really think you could hide behind a gangster and play house forever? Did you think putting on a pretty dress and pretending to be somebody made you untouchable?" He leaned in. "You're nothing, Evelyn. You've always been nothing. And in about 45 minutes, 2 U.S. Marshals are going to walk through that door with a federal order, and they are going to take my son. And there is nothing your pet criminal can do to stop it." Evelyn couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. 200 of the most powerful people in the city stood frozen around them, watching. And Evelyn Hart felt every molecule of strength she'd built over the last 2 months dissolve like sugar in acid. Luca hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He stood perfectly still beside her, one hand on her back, his eyes fixed on Grayson with an expression that contained no anger, no fury, no threat. Just patience. The terrible, absolute patience of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Are you finished?" Luca asked. Grayson blinked. "Because if you're finished," Luca continued, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearest guest to hear, "I'd like to introduce you to someone." He raised his hand. From the crowd, a woman stepped forward, mid-50s, steel gray hair, dark suit, an expression that could have been carved from granite. Evelyn didn't recognize her, but Grayson did. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. "This is District Attorney Helen Caraway," Luca said, his voice perfectly level. "She's been reviewing a file I submitted to her office 11 days ago. A file containing financial records, wire transfers, foundation audits, sealed police reports, hospital intake photographs, and 14 sworn depositions from former employees of the Hale family, including 3 who witnessed Grayson Robert Hale assault his wife on separate occasions and were paid to remain silent." Grayson's smile was gone. "The file also contains evidence that Judge Catherine Marsden received a $200,000 campaign contribution from the Hale Family Foundation 6 weeks ago," Luca continued, "which makes the emergency custody order she signed tonight not just procedurally questionable, but potentially criminal." D.A. Caraway stepped forward. She looked at Grayson the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'd advise you not to leave the city." Grayson's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked at Evelyn, and for the first time, the very first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of consequences, not the fear of exposure. The fear of a man who had just realized he was standing in a room full of witnesses, holding a document signed by a compromised judge, facing a woman he'd beaten and a man who had spent weeks building the architecture of his destruction, and understood, with a clarity that was already too late, that he had walked into the trap willingly. He had come to take her son. Instead, he had delivered himself. Luca turned to Evelyn. The room held its breath. 200 guests, the string quartet silent now, every eye fixed on the man in the black suit and the woman in the emerald gown. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box. "I believe we have an announcement to make," he said. And Evelyn Hart, standing in the ruins of everything Grayson Hale had tried to build against her, looked at the man she'd sworn she would never trust and felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Not safety, not gratitude, power. She extended her hand. Luca slid the ring onto her finger in front of 200 witnesses, and the room erupted. Not in applause, Not yet. First came the silence, the held breath, muscle-locked silence of people who had just watched a man dismantle a political dynasty in real time and then propose to a woman standing in the wreckage. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough for Evelyn to feel the weight of the diamond settle against her knuckle, long enough for Luca's fingers to close around hers and hold, long enough for Grayson Hale to take one involuntary step backward, like the floor had shifted beneath him. Then the applause came. It started near the front. A few deliberate claps from guests who understood that this wasn't a celebration, it was a pledge of allegiance, and spread backward through the crowd until the grand hall thundered with it. Camera phones rose, flashes popped. The string quartet launched into something triumphant that nobody had rehearsed. Evelyn didn't hear any of it. She was looking at Luca. He was looking at her. And in the narrow space between their bodies, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his chest, close enough that she could see the vein in his temple still pulsing. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with performance. "Breathe," he murmured. She realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled. Her ribs ached with it. "Is it over?" she whispered. Not yet. He was right. Grayson hadn't left. He was standing exactly where he'd been. 6 feet away. The court order still crumpled in his fist, his face cycling through emotions too fast to catalog. Shock. Fury. Calculation. And underneath all of it, something animal and cornered that Evelyn recognized from the nights he'd come home drunk and wired, when the surface charm peeled back and what lived underneath came crawling out. D.A. Caraway had moved to the edge of the crowd, speaking into her phone in low, clipped tones. 2 of Luca's security team had positioned themselves within arm's reach of Grayson. Not obviously, not aggressively, but close enough that any sudden movement would be met with immediate force. Grayson's eyes locked onto Evelyn. "This doesn't change anything," he said. His voice was low enough that only she and Luca could hear it. Controlled. But the control was cracking at the edges. A ring doesn't make you a mother. A ring doesn't undo what you did. What she did, Luca said, was survive you. She kidnapped my son. She protected your son. From you. And every hospital report, every sealed photograph, every deposition sitting in D.A. Caraway's office right now tells exactly the same story. Grayson's jaw clenched so hard Evelyn could see the muscles jump beneath his skin. "You think you've won something here," he said. "You think because you've got some bought district attorney and a room full of sycophants clapping for you that this is over? My family has been in this city for 4 generations. We've survived investigations. We've survived scandals. We've survived men a hell of a lot more dangerous than you." Luca tilted his head. That predatory adjustment of angle, the one that meant he was done being patient. "No," he said, "you haven't." Grayson moved, not toward Luca, toward Evelyn. It was fast, the instinctive lunge of a man whose control had finally shattered. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, the same wrist he'd grabbed 100 times before, his fingers digging into the soft tissue between bone and tendon with a grip that was pure muscle memory. He yanked her toward him, and she felt her shoulder wrench and her feet leave the floor for a fraction of a second, and then Luca was there. He didn't hit Grayson. He didn't need to. He caught Grayson's forearm with one hand and twisted. A precise, mechanical rotation that bent the joint past its natural range and forced Grayson's grip open. Evelyn stumbled backward. Luca's other hand pressed flat against Grayson's chest and pushed. Not hard, not violently, but with a controlled force that sent Grayson staggering back 3 steps into the waiting arms of 2 security men who locked his shoulders before he could recover. The entire exchange took less than 4 seconds. The room saw all of it. 200 phones captured it. And what they recorded was this: a man grabbing a woman hard enough to bruise her, and another man stopping it without throwing a single punch. Grayson had come to provoke violence. He'd provided it himself. "Get him out," Luca said. The security men moved Grayson toward the service entrance. He fought them. Not effectively, not with any real chance of breaking free, but with the thrashing, desperate energy of a man who understood that every step away from that room was a step toward an ending he couldn't reverse. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracked. The Polish was gone now, stripped away, and what was left was raw and ugly and pathetically small. "She's my wife. That's my son. You can't just take them. Evelyn watched him being dragged away. She watched his expensive shoes scuff against the marble. She watched his face contort into something she'd seen 1,000 times in the privacy of their home, but never once in public. The real Grayson, the one beneath the charm, the one who hit and choked and broke things because the world wouldn't arrange itself the way he demanded. 200 people saw it, and for the first time in 4 years, Evelyn Hart felt the full weight of her own truth validated by witnesses who couldn't be silenced, bought, or intimidated. She didn't cry. She turned back to the room. She found Luca. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin and looked at the crowd of powerful, frightened, fascinated people who were staring at her like she'd just emerged from a fire. "I believe," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "my fiancé was about to offer everyone a drink." The tension broke. Laughter. Relief. A swell of murmured conversation that rose and filled the room like water returning to a channel. Waiters appeared with champagne. The string quartet resumed, and the engagement party of Luca Moretti and Evelyn Hart lurched back into motion as if what had just happened was merely an interruption and not the demolition of a man's entire life. Luca found her 30 minutes later on the terrace. She was standing at the stone railing, her hands gripping the cold surface, staring out at the estate's grounds where security lights carved bright lanes through the darkness. Her shoulders were shaking, not from cold, from the sustained post-adrenaline tremor of a body that had been running on fear for hours and was finally starting to crash. He stood beside her without speaking. She let the silence hold for a long time. "He grabbed me," she said finally, "in front of everyone, in front of 200 people and cameras, and he just grabbed me, like nothing had changed, like none of this was real." "It's real. I know it's real. That's what terrifies me." She turned to face him. Her mascara hadn't smudged. Her hair was still in place. She looked flawless, and she felt demolished. Because real means it can end. Real means it can be taken away. Arrangements are safe because they have terms and expiration dates. This doesn't have that anymore. Luca looked at her. The terrace was quiet. Inside, 200 guests were drinking champagne and building their own versions of the evening's story. Out here, it was just the two of them and the dark and the sound of her breathing. "No," he said, "it doesn't. Does that scare you?" "More than anything I've faced in 20 years. The admission cracked something open between them. Not the slow, careful negotiation of two people testing boundaries. Something sudden and total. Like a wall that had been holding back water and finally gave way. Evelyn stepped toward him, close enough that her chest pressed against his, close enough to feel his heartbeat through the fabric of his suit. Still fast, still harder than it should have been, still betraying the man underneath the mask. "I need you to promise me something," she said. "What?" "That whatever happens with the courts, with Grayson's family, with all of it, you won't let them take Noah. I don't care about the legal process. I don't care about the proper channels. If it comes down to it, if they come for my son, you stop them, by whatever means necessary." Luca's hand came up and cupped the side of her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, the same bone Grayson had fractured 2 years ago. His touch was impossibly gentle for a man whose hands had done the things she knew his had done. "Nobody is taking your son," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever." She kissed him. Not gently. Not carefully. Not the way someone kissed when they were performing for cameras or rehearsing for an audience. She kissed him with the desperate, ferocious honesty of a woman who had spent 4 years being broken and 7 months being rebuilt, and one single, terrifying evening discovering that the man she was supposed to be pretending to love was the only person in the world she actually trusted. He kissed her back. His hand settled at her waist, pulling her closer. Her fingers gripped the lapels of his suit. The kiss tasted like champagne and adrenaline, and something underneath both that was raw and human, and nothing like the sanitized version of romance she'd been performing for weeks. When they finally separated, both of them were breathing hard. "Well," Luca said. His voice was rough, wrecked. "That complicates the arrangement. The arrangement ended an hour ago." "I know. Are you okay with that?" He looked at her, and for the first time the mask dropped completely. Not a crack, not a fissure, but a full surrender. She saw the boy whose mother had been murdered. She saw the man who had built an empire out of fury and trauma and the absolute refusal to let anyone hurt the vulnerable again. She saw someone who was more afraid of what he felt for her than he had ever been of any rival, any threat, any bullet. "I have never been less okay in my entire life," he said, "and I wouldn't change it." Inside, Luca's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and read the screen. His face changed. The tenderness vanished. The softness evaporated. What replaced it was something cold and focused and lethal. The face of the man the city feared, the one who solved problems in ways that left no evidence and no witnesses. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. Grayson didn't come alone. Her blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" Luca turned the phone toward her. A text from Marco, 4 words. East Wing, breach attempt. Evelyn's vision narrowed to a single blinding point. East Wing. Noah. The nursery. Her son. She was running before Luca could speak. She heard him behind her, his footsteps, then his voice barking orders into his phone. But she wasn't listening. She was moving through the grand hall, pushing past guests who turned to stare, shoving through a service door, sprinting down a corridor she'd walked 1,000 times, but never like this, never at this speed, never with this acid-bright terror flooding every nerve in her body. The East Wing corridor was chaos. 2 of Luca's personal detail were positioned at the staircase entrance, weapons drawn. Marco was at the far end of the hall, speaking into a radio. An alarm she'd never heard before was pulsing. Not loud, not the blaring kind from movies, but a low, insistent tone that vibrated in her teeth. "Where is he?" she screamed. "Where's Noah?" Marco turned. His face was taut but controlled. "The nursery is secure. Teresa has him. 2 men inside, locked door, no one has entered." "Then what's the breach?" "Someone accessed the East Wing service stairwell using a duplicated badge. They made it to the 2nd floor landing before our people intercepted." "Who?" "We're working on it. He's in custody. He's not talking." Evelyn pushed past Marco and ran to the nursery door. She pounded on it. "Teresa, it's me. Open the door." A pause. The sound of a deadbolt turning. The door opened 3 inches and Teresa's face appeared. Pale, frightened, but steady. "He's fine," Teresa said immediately. "He slept through the whole thing." Evelyn pushed inside. Noah was in his crib, on his back, one arm thrown above his head, his chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of a baby who had no idea that the world was trying to tear him apart. She pressed her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat, strong, even, impossibly calm beneath her shaking palm. She stayed like that for a long time, bent over the crib, one hand on her son, the other gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. Luca appeared in the doorway. She didn't look up. "Who was it?" she asked. "A man named Dennis Keenan, private investigator, licensed and bonded, hired by the Hale family's law firm." "What was he doing?" "Attempting to reach the nursery with a portable camera and a court document authorizing him to document Noah's living conditions. They sent someone to film my baby's room during a party. They sent someone to build evidence, footage of a child living in the home of a criminal organization, footage of armed security personnel around an infant, footage that makes protective measures look like imprisonment." Evelyn closed her eyes. Her hand was still on Noah's chest. His heartbeat was the only thing keeping her anchored. "This won't stop," she said. "Even with the DA, even with the evidence, even with Grayson humiliated in front of the entire city. His family has too much money, too many connections. They'll find another judge, another angle, another way in." "Yes," Luca said. "So what do we do?" Luca walked into the nursery. He stopped beside the crib and looked down at Noah, sleeping, oblivious, perfect, with an expression that Evelyn had never seen on his face before. Not tenderness exactly, though it was close. Something more primitive. Something that predated language and logic and operated on a frequency that bypassed the brain entirely and went straight to the spine. The look of a man staring at something he would kill to protect. "I end it," he said. "How?" "Not through the courts, not through lawyers, not through strategy or evidence or public appearances." He looked up at her. "I go to the source." The source. Grayson's father, Richard Hale, the patriarch, The money. The machine that makes all of this run. And do what? Have a conversation. The way he said the word conversation made Evelyn's skin prickle. It didn't sound like talking. It sounded like a door closing, like an ending. What kind of conversation? Luca reached into the crib and adjusted Noah's blanket, a gesture so mundane and so impossibly tender that it nearly broke her. He tucked the edge beneath Noah's chin with the careful precision of a man who had never done this before but understood instinctively that it mattered. The kind where I show him everything I have, Luca said. Every financial record, every wire transfer, every bribe, every sealed report, every photograph. And then I show him what happens if it becomes public. You're going to blackmail him. I'm going to give him a choice. Walk away from Evelyn and Noah permanently. No custody claims, no investigations, no contact, ever. Or watch me hand Dia Caraway enough evidence to put him, his son, and half his organization in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. He'll fight. He'll calculate. Men like Richard Hale don't fight. They calculate. And when the calculation tells him that the cost of pursuing his grandson exceeds the cost of abandoning him, he'll do what men like him always do. What's that? Survive. Evelyn stood in the nursery with her hand on her sleeping son and looked at the man who had entered her life as a transaction and become something she didn't have a word for yet. He was asking her to trust him with everything, not just her safety, not just her future, but her son's life and her own moral center and the fragile, newly reconstructed thing inside her chest that she was terrified to call love, because the last time she'd called something love, it had broken her bones. When? She asked. Tomorrow morning. I'm coming with you. No. I'm coming with you, Luca. Evelyn, he beat me for 4 years. He fractured my face. He tried to take my son tonight. I'm going to stand in that room, and I'm going to look that family in the eye, and they are going to see the woman they tried to destroy still standing. That's not negotiable. Luca studied her for a long time. The nursery was silent except for Noah's breathing and the distant pulse of the security alarm still cycling through the estate. All right, he said finally. Evelyn turned back to the crib. She leaned down and pressed her lips against Noah's forehead. Warm, soft, smelling of baby soap and sleep. Tomorrow, she whispered against his skin. Tomorrow it ends. And 40 miles across the city, in the mahogany-paneled study of a Georgian mansion that had housed 4 generations of wealth and corruption, Richard Hale set down his phone and stared at the wall where portraits of his ancestors hung in gilded frames. His son was in police custody. His judge was compromised. His private investigator was in the hands of a man who solved problems with a permanence that old money couldn't buy. He poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and drank it in one swallow. The glass trembled in his hand. For the first time in 40 years, Richard Hale was afraid. And the morning was coming fast. The car pulled through the iron gates of the Hale estate at 7:15 in the morning. Evelyn sat in the back seat, with her hands folded in her lap, watching the Georgian mansion materialize through the windshield like something from a fever dream. White columns, manicured hedges trimmed to surgical precision, a circular driveway paved in imported stone that probably cost more per square foot than any apartment she'd ever rented. The kind of house that announced its own importance before you reached the front door. She'd been here before. 4 years ago, Grayson had brought her to meet his parents 3 weeks after their second date. She'd worn a dress she couldn't afford and shoes that pinched her toes and smiled so hard her face ached, desperate to impress the family of the man she thought she loved. Richard Hale had shaken her hand with both of his and called her sweetheart. Margaret Hale had complimented her earrings and served tea in porcelain cups so thin they were almost transparent. They'd seemed warm. They'd seemed kind. 6 months later, when Evelyn showed up at their front door with a split lip and blood in her hair, begging them to make their son stop, Richard Hale had closed the door in her face, and Margaret Hale had called Grayson to tell him where his wife was. Evelyn remembered the sound of that door closing more clearly than she remembered the sound of her own jaw breaking. She wasn't shaking this time. Luca sat beside her. Dark suit, no tie. His face was a mask of absolute stillness, the expression of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome and made his peace with all of them. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the Moretti estate. He hadn't needed to. The file on his lap, a thick manila folder dense with documents, photographs, financial records, said everything that needed to be said. Marco was driving. 2 additional vehicles followed at a measured distance. Security, not display. Luca wasn't making a show of force. He was making a point. I can reach you anywhere. The car stopped. Marco opened the door. Luca stepped out first and extended his hand to Evelyn. She took it. The ring caught the morning light, the diamond he'd placed on her finger 14 hours ago in front of 200 witnesses who were right now waking up to a news cycle that would define this city for weeks. They walked to the front door together. Luca knocked once. A housekeeper opened the door, a middle-aged woman with a uniform similar to the one Evelyn had worn at the Moretti estate. The woman's eyes widened slightly at the sight of them, then went carefully blank. "Mr. Hale is expecting you," she said, and led them through a foyer that smelled like furniture polish and old money. Richard Hale was waiting in his study. The room was exactly as Evelyn remembered it. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture, a massive desk that sat beneath a window overlooking 3 acres of landscaped grounds. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with leather-bound volumes that nobody had ever read. Above the fireplace, an oil painting of the Hale family. Richard, Margaret, Grayson, and his older sister Claire stared down at the room with the vacant, commissioned smiles of people who paid to look dignified. Richard was standing behind his desk. He was 68 years old, silver-haired, barrel-chested, with the tanned, weathered face of a man who played golf 4 days a week and drank single malt every evening. He'd built a real estate empire from his father's construction company, bought political influence the way other men bought suits, and maintained a reputation as a civic leader and philanthropist that was immaculate, impenetrable, and entirely constructed. He looked at Luca first, then at Evelyn. Something moved across his face when he saw her. Not guilt, not shame, something more uncomfortable than either. The involuntary flinch of a man confronted by evidence of his own choices that he'd spent years refusing to examine. "Sit down," Richard said. "We'll stand," Luca replied. Richard's jaw tightened. He sat down himself, slowly, deliberately, reclaiming what authority he could in a room that no longer belonged to him. "Where's Grayson?" he asked. "In county lockup," Luca said. "Assault charges from last night, battery." D.A. Carraway added a preliminary charge of witness intimidation based on the messages he sent to Evelyn over the past 3 weeks. Those charges won't stick. They don't need to stick. They need to exist long enough for every news outlet in this city to run the story. And they will. They're already running it. Luca set the manila folder on Richard's desk. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The weight of it, physical and metaphorical, occupied the space between them like a loaded weapon. "Let me tell you what's in this file," Luca said, "and then let me tell you what happens next." Richard stared at the folder but didn't touch it. 14 sworn depositions from former employees of this family. 3 from household staff who witnessed Grayson strike Evelyn on separate occasions. 2 from employees of your foundation who were instructed to redirect funds to cover Grayson's legal expenses after the second divorce filing. 1 from a former campaign aide to Judge Catherine Marsden who has direct knowledge of the $200,000 contribution your foundation made to her re-election fund. The same judge who signed the emergency custody order last night. Richard's face didn't change, but his hands did. They moved to the desk surface and pressed flat. The same gesture Luca made when he was containing something volatile. The similarity wasn't lost on Evelyn. Different men, same mechanism of control. The file also contains, Luca continued, complete financial records from the Hale Family Foundation for the past 12 years, including wire transfers to offshore accounts, payments to private investigators, and a pattern of expenditures that D.A. Carraway's forensic accountants have described to me as, and I'm quoting directly, one of the most comprehensive cases of foundation fraud they've ever reviewed. Silence. "You're threatening me," Richard said. "I'm informing you. You think I'm afraid of a thug in an expensive suit?" Luca's expression didn't change. "I think you're sitting behind a desk in a house you built on bribes and sealed police reports. And I think you're looking at a folder that contains enough evidence to take all of it away. I think your son is in jail. I think your judge is compromised. I think your private investigator is cooperating with my legal team. And I think that in approximately 90 seconds, you're going to ask me what I want, because men like you always ask that question when they realize the conversation is no longer about winning." Richard Hale stared at him. 90 seconds passed. "What do you want?" he asked. Luca didn't answer. He turned to Evelyn. She understood. This was hers. She stepped forward. She stood in front of the desk where Richard Hale sat. The man who had closed a door in her face while she bled on his doorstep. The man who had paid to bury police reports and hospital records. The man who had raised a son who broke women and then built a machine to cover up the damage. She looked at him the way she'd never been able to look at him before. Not with fear. Not with pleading. Not with the desperate, broken hope of a young wife begging her father-in-law to make the violence stop. She looked at him with the steady, unflinching certainty of a woman who had survived everything his family had done to her and was still standing. Full termination of Grayson's parental rights, she said. Her voice was even, controlled. The voice of a woman who had practiced this speech in her head 1,000 times, but was delivering it now with a calm she hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain. Voluntary. Filed by your family's attorneys. No challenges, no appeals, no conditions. Richard's eye twitched. A legally binding agreement, she continued, that no member of the Hale family will attempt to contact me or my son, ever. No private investigators, no surveillance, no intermediaries, no holiday cards, nothing. That's my grandson. That's my son, and your family has never treated him as anything other than leverage. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Margaret loves that boy. Margaret never held him. Not once. In 4 years of marriage, your wife held Noah exactly 0 times. She held him at arm's length, the way she held everything, at a distance that allowed her to claim attachment without accepting responsibility. Richard flinched. A real one. The first honest reaction she'd seen from him. Third, Evelyn said, the Hale Family Foundation makes a $5 million contribution to the National Domestic Violence Network. Public. Documented. Tax deductible. A gesture of civic responsibility from one of the city's most prominent philanthropic families. You want me to fund? I want you to put your money where your reputation is. You've spent 40 years building the image of a family that gives back to the community. Here's your chance to actually do it. Richard looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. And maybe he was. Maybe all those years ago, when she'd stood on his doorstep bleeding and begging, he'd looked at her and seen what Grayson had taught him to see. A problem. An inconvenience. A woman who was making things difficult. Now she was making things permanent. And if I refuse? Richard asked. Luca spoke. Then D.A. Carraway files charges tomorrow morning. The foundation records go public. The depositions are released to every major news outlet in the country. Judge Marsden's contribution becomes the lead story on every legal blog and cable news network. And your family's name, the name you've spent 4 decades polishing, becomes synonymous with domestic violence, judicial corruption, and financial fraud. He paused. You'll survive it. Men like you always survive. But the name won't, the foundation won't, the political relationships won't. And every door that's ever opened for the name Hale will close. Permanently. Richard sat in his chair for a long time. His hands were still flat on the desk. The study was quiet, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of a gardener's mower on the front lawn. He looked at the folder. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Luca. I need to speak with my attorneys, he said. You have until noon, Luca replied. They left. The drive back to the Moretti estate was silent. Evelyn sat in the back seat with the window down, letting the morning air hit her face. It was cool and clean and smelled like cut grass and exhaust and something green and growing. She breathed it in deep and felt it fill parts of her lungs that had been closed off for years. Luca's hand found hers on the seat between them. He didn't squeeze, he didn't pull, he just held it, loose, warm, present. You were extraordinary, he said quietly. I was terrified. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She turned to look at him. Morning light caught the angles of his face and softened them. Or maybe it wasn't the light. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that he'd been awake for 36 hours and the mask he wore was finally too heavy to hold in place. He looked tired. He looked human. He looked like a man she could love without losing herself. What if he doesn't agree? She asked. He'll agree. How do you know? Because I've spent 20 years studying men like Richard Hale. They worship legacy. Everything they build for the name. Threaten the business, they adapt. Threaten the money, they restructure. But threaten the name, threaten the story they tell themselves about who they are, and they'll sacrifice anything, including their own grandson. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a current of bitterness that ran deep. Old bitterness, the kind that came from understanding a particular type of man too well because you'd been shaped by one. Evelyn didn't ask about his father. Not yet. She knew enough. She knew a mother had been killed and a boy had grown up in the wreckage and built an empire from the ruins of his own childhood. She knew that Luca Moretti's entire existence was an act of refusal, a refusal to become the thing that destroyed his family, even as he became something just as dangerous. She'd ask him about it eventually. When the dust settled, when the noise stopped, when they had time to sit across from each other without a crisis between them and learn the full shape of each other's damage. For now, she held his hand and watched the city slide past the car window and waited. The call came at 11:43. Luca answered it on speaker. His attorney's voice, clipped, professional, barely containing something that sounded dangerously close to satisfaction. They've agreed all three conditions. Full termination of parental rights, no contact agreement, $5 million contribution. Papers are being drafted now. They want signatures by end of day. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. One additional concession, the attorney continued. Richard Hale has agreed to cover all legal fees incurred by Ms. Hart during the custody proceedings and has consented to the permanent sealing of the evidence file on the condition that no further legal action is pursued against the Hale family. Luca looked at Evelyn. Your call, he said. She thought about it. She thought about justice, real justice, the kind that involved courtrooms and sentences, and the public dismantling of a family that had enabled a monster. She thought about how satisfying it would be to watch the Hale name collapse under the weight of its own sins. Then she thought about Noah, about the years of legal battles, the depositions, the press coverage, the fact that her son would grow up with his biological father's crimes as the defining narrative of his childhood. Seal it, she said. I don't need revenge. I need it to be over. Luca nodded once. Seal it, he told the attorney. The line went dead. Evelyn sat in the back seat of the car and let out a sound she'd been holding inside for 4 years. Not a scream, not a sob. Something more fundamental, a long, shuddering exhale that started in the deepest part of her chest and worked its way up through her throat and out into the open air, carrying with it the compressed weight of every sleepless night, every emergency room visit, every moment she'd spent calculating whether she could survive another day in a house that was killing her. It was over. Not the way stories ended in movies, with dramatic music and slow-motion shots and the villain in handcuffs. It ended with a phone call and a legal agreement and the quiet, unglamorous reality of a wealthy family choosing self-preservation over everything else. It was ugly and transactional and completely devoid of catharsis. And it was the most beautiful thing Evelyn had ever heard. The weeks that followed were strange and slow and unfamiliar. The custody papers were signed. Grayson's parental rights were terminated in a closed proceeding that lasted 40 minutes. The assault charges were processed and pled down to a misdemeanor. Luca's legal team recommended allowing it to avoid prolonged litigation. Grayson accepted a deal that included mandatory anger management, a restraining order, and voluntary relocation overseas. He was on a plane to London within 10 days. He didn't fight it. Evelyn had expected him to. She'd braced herself for rage, for retaliation, for the vindictive, scorched earth fury of a man who couldn't stand to lose. Instead, she got silence. A signature on a document. A departure without a word. Marco told her later that Grayson had tried to send a letter through his attorney. Luca's team intercepted it. Marco asked if she wanted to read it. She said no. Some words didn't deserve an audience. The estate changed slowly. Not physically. The marble was still marble. The chandeliers still caught the light the same way. The hallways still echoed with the particular acoustics of a building designed to intimidate. But the atmosphere changed. The tension that had lived in the walls like a low-frequency hum began to dissipate, replaced by something quieter and less familiar. Noise. Not the noise of business. The late-night meetings, the clipped phone calls, the weighted silences of men conducting affairs that never appeared on any ledger. A different kind. Noah's noise. His laughter echoed through the corridors in the mornings. His babbling filled the kitchen during breakfast. His shrieks of delight when Teresa swung him around in the garden carried through open windows and bounced off stone walls that had never absorbed anything so innocent. The staff responded to it. Evelyn noticed subtle shifts she wouldn't have caught months ago, but recognized now. The head housekeeper started leaving fresh flowers in the nursery without being asked. The kitchen staff began preparing meals at Noah-friendly hours instead of the late, erratic schedule Luca's lifestyle had always demanded. Even Marco, stone-faced, humorless Marco, was caught one afternoon making faces at Noah through the nursery window when he thought nobody was watching. The house was learning how to hold a family. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't natural. It was awkward and halting and sometimes painfully clumsy, like watching a structure designed for war try to accommodate something as fragile as a child's laugh. But it was happening, and Luca was changing too, not in the ways the world would notice. He was still the man who made entire rooms go quiet when he entered. He still conducted business with the cold precision that had built his empire. He still carried himself with the controlled menace of someone who understood violence intimately and kept it on a leash so short it barely breathed. But at home, and it was home now, not the estate, not the property, but home, the leash loosened. Evelyn saw it first in the mornings. Luca had always been an early riser, but now he came downstairs before anyone else was awake and made coffee in the kitchen himself instead of waiting for staff. He'd stand at the counter in a t-shirt and bare feet, grinding beans, pouring water, performing the mundane ritual with the same attention he gave everything, precise, deliberate, focused. And when Evelyn came down with Noah on her hip, he'd pour her a cup without being asked and hand it to her the way she took it, which he'd memorized without either of them acknowledging it. She saw it in the evenings. He started coming to the nursery after dinner, not every night, but often enough that it became a pattern. He'd stand in the doorway while Evelyn gave Noah his bottle, watching with an expression that was still guarded but less armored than it used to be. One night, she handed Noah to him without asking. Luca held the baby against his chest with one arm, his free hand supporting Noah's head, and for several minutes they just stood there, the man and the child, breathing in the same rhythm. Noah fell asleep against Luca's shoulder. Luca didn't move for 20 minutes. She saw it in the way he touched her, not the performative touches they'd rehearsed for public appearances, the calculated hand on the small of her back, the choreographed proximity. Real touches. Quiet ones. His fingers brushing against hers when they passed in a hallway, his hand settling on her knee beneath a table during dinner. The way he pushed a strand of hair behind her ear one evening while she was reading, the gesture so casual and so intimate that it stopped her mid-sentence and made her look up at him with a question she didn't need to ask because his eyes were already answering it. One night, 3 weeks after the papers were signed, 2 weeks after Grayson left the country, on an evening when the estate was quiet and Noah was sleeping and the world outside the gates had finally stopped demanding their attention, Luca told her about his mother. They were on the terrace, the same terrace where they'd kissed the night of the engagement party. It was late. The grounds were dark and still. Luca was sitting in a chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the ground the way he sometimes did when the mask came off and what was underneath needed air. Her name was Sophia, he said. She was 31 when she died, the same age you are now. Evelyn sat beside him and said nothing. My father was a businessman, not the kind I became. Smaller, more legitimate, but connected to the same world. He hit her. Everyone knew. Nobody did anything. She tried to leave twice. The first time he broke her wrist and told her it was an accident. The second time he found her at her sister's house and dragged her back by her hair in front of the neighbors. His voice was steady. Not detached. Steady. The steadiness of someone who had told this story to himself so many times that the words had worn smooth, like stones in a river. The third time she tried to leave, he killed her, in the kitchen. I was 7. I was in the next room. I heard everything. Evelyn reached over and placed her hand on his forearm. He didn't pull away. He didn't lean in. He let her touch anchor him. I built everything I have because of that night, he said. Every business, every connection, every dollar, every ounce of power. I built it because I decided, at 7 years old, sitting in a hallway listening to my mother die, that I would become the thing that men like my father were afraid of. He turned his head and looked at her, And then you walked into my dining room in a maid's uniform with cracked hands and a fake name and a baby you'd die for. And I saw her. I saw my mother. I saw what she would have looked like if she'd made it out. Evelyn's eyes burned. That's why you helped me, she said. That's why I started. That's not why I'm still here. She leaned toward him. He met her halfway. Their foreheads touched. A gesture so simple and so loaded with everything they'd survived together that it felt like more than a kiss, more than a declaration, more than any words either of them could have strung together. I'm still here, he said quietly, because you're the first person who's ever looked at everything I am and didn't flinch. I flinched a little. Fair, she smiled. He didn't quite smile back, but the lines around his eyes softened in a way that meant the same thing. They stayed on the terrace until the sky started to lighten, not talking, not needing to, just existing in the same space, breathing the same air, watching the world turn from dark to gray to the first pale gold of dawn. Evelyn thought about the woman she'd been 7 months ago, the woman who'd walked into a forger's apartment with $200 and a baby and a name she was about to bury. The woman who'd scrubbed floors in a dead man's dining hall because it was the only job she could get without documentation. The woman who'd stood over her son's crib every night calculating how many more days she could survive. That woman wasn't gone. She was still here. In the muscle memory of Evelyn's hands, in the way she still checked locks twice before bed, in the way she still flinched at loud sounds and still slept with the baby monitor's volume turned to maximum and still, on certain nights, dreamed about the sound of Grayson's footsteps on hardwood floors. Those things wouldn't disappear. Survival left scars that didn't fade just because the danger was over. She'd carry them. The wariness, the hypervigilance, the bone-deep knowledge of what it felt like to be powerless for the rest of her life. But she'd carry them standing up. As dawn broke over the Moretti estate on a quiet morning in early autumn, Evelyn walked down to the kitchen and found Luca already there, barefoot, making coffee. Noah was awake in his high chair, banging a plastic spoon against the tray with the enthusiastic arrhythmia of a baby discovering that objects made noise. Luca looked up when she entered. He was holding 2 cups. He handed her one, prepared exactly the way she liked it, the way he'd memorized without asking and never once gotten wrong. She took it, their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows and pooled on the floor around Noah's high chair, turning the marble warm and gold. The baby dropped his spoon, shrieked with delight, and reached for Luca with both arms. Luca set down his coffee and picked him up. He held Noah against his chest with one arm, his free hand cradling the back of the baby's head, and looked at Evelyn across the kitchen with an expression that contained no mask, no calculation, no strategy. Just a man, holding a child, looking at a woman he'd stopped pretending not to love. Evelyn leaned against the counter and sipped her coffee and watched them. The crime lord and the infant, the man the city feared and the baby who laughed at his face, and felt something settle inside her chest with the quiet permanence of a foundation being poured. Not safety, not gratitude, not the cautious, conditional peace of a woman who was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Something deeper, something that had been earned through violence and fear and impossible choices and the stubborn, furious, unrelenting refusal to be destroyed. Home. Not the building, not the marble and the chandeliers and the security gates, the people inside it. What began as a desperate bargain between a fugitive nurse and a man the world called a monster had become something neither of them had the vocabulary for when it started. It had been forged in threat and deception and the worst kind of pressure. It had been tested by a man who thought he owned her, and a family that thought they were untouchable, and a world that didn't believe a woman who scrubbed floors could stand beside a king. They were wrong. Noah grabbed a fistful of Luca's shirt and pulled. Luca winced. Evelyn laughed. The real kind. The kind that started in her belly and worked its way up and came out loud and unguarded and completely free. The sound echoed through the hallways of the Moretti estate. It was the best thing those walls had ever heard.